Carol, Tami and I want to thank you for your willingness to share your experiences with violence against women, researcher-practitioner collaborations in the criminal justice system.
My pleasure.
So we're going to start by, if you could just, introduce yourself, tell me a little bit about, your role in your organization, the name of your organization, and then from there we can start talking about the different researcher-practitioner collaborations you've been involved in. You can talk about all of them. You can talk about maybe ones that you specifically want to talk about, and then we can just take it from there.
My name is Carol Jordan. I am an assistant provost here at the University of Kentucky, and I am director of the Center for Research on Violence Against Women here at UK. I've been in the field of violence against women for almost 30 years, believe it or not. So I come at this issue of researcher to advocate or practitioner collaboration from kind of a unique perspective. I am in academia now, but have spent the bulk of my career, the first 20 years or so, on the policy and advocacy side. So it's probably the case that the importance I attach to collaborations between researchers and advocates comes largely because I wasn't originally a researcher. And I think I understood when I came here into academia that those kinds of collaborations were exceedingly important. And so I think I'm a hybrid, and I think in fact, in future, having more hybrids is probably going to be helpful. Having more researchers embedded in practicing agencies of one kind or another, in policy agencies, and then having more advocates and policy folks in academia, I think will also be helpful. To me, the collaboration has to happen for three major reasons. First is one I would think I approach it as a metaphor. The violence against women movement overall for the past now going on 40 years has been largely about direct services to victims and survivors, to answering crisis lines in the middle of the night, to having police arrive on a scene, to having a judge make a decision in a case, to having a prosecutor decide whether to go forward in a prosecution, etc. Direct services, development of policy, changing statutes. That has been our primary focus. It's been our priority, and I think it will always be our priority. It is, if you will, the riverbank work. It is being at the side of the river, pulling out drowning people. But a graduate school professor of mine once said, it's always very important to pull drowning people out of a river, but at some point you have to go upriver and see who's throwing them in. And to my way of thinking, academia is what is upriver. Because upriver, we need to start thinking not just about how to best help a survivor, but we also got to understand better why violence happens, to whom, who's most at risk, what kinds of interventions are going to be effective. Ultimately, how can we prevent violence? We've got to start coming with answers. So that those answers will not be able to be asked effectively nor answered effectively if we do not have connection on that riverbank, if you will, between the advocates and practitioners who are providing services and the researchers who have the capacity to answer the questions upstream so that we can change the way we're providing services for survivors, and ultimately we can end violence against women.
How many collaborations or partnerships would you estimate you've been involved in your 30 some odd years?
I think it's evolved over time. Now I don't think there's any project that we undertake that is not a collaborative. And it did not begin that way at all. When I came here into academia, it was clear to me that those kinds of collaborations did not exist. We were going to build this program upriver, this upriver program of addressing violence against women as a research question, try to define violence against women as an area of science. We were going to start doing all of that, connecting researchers around the country and all those kinds of things, but I felt we could not do that if we didn't involve advocates, and I didn't see those kinds of connections happening. And that's a mistake. It's a mistake because if we don't involve advocates and practitioners in the research questions we ask, we're going to either ask the wrong questions or we're going to interpret the findings incorrectly. I was once at a large conference, research conference on stalking, and there were a lot of really high-profile, terrific researchers in the room. And one researcher began to talk about a research project he had done on domestic violence protective orders. And what he was sharing was his evaluation of these so-called mutual orders of protection. Now, those who have been on the practice or advocacy side know that mutual orders of protection, it's anathema. We don't like them. Essentially what it means is that a woman seeks protection from the court, and the judge says, yes, I'm going to give you the order of protection, but I'll tell you what, the conditions I'm going to place on the offending person here, on the respondent, I'm also going to place on you. So these conditions of this order apply equally to both of you. That's a mutual order of protection. We know women ultimately end up getting victimized by the system when those kinds of orders are, at least that has been the practice experience, that has anecdotally been the experience. So advocates and practitioners don't typically like those. But this researcher felt he wanted to evaluate why. And sure enough, what he found was that, in his study, was that in the case of mutual orders, he found lower rates of reported violation. And he felt like what that showed was evidence that mutual orders of protections are more effective. Now, as a policymaker and advocate and sort of new to the research area, I was sitting there thinking to myself, he's missing the entire interpretation, he's missing the entire context with his findings. I'm not saying that he collected the data incorrectly or that he used the wrong statistical analysis package or any of that. Those things may have been completely correct. But he's missing the context, because what the context would tell you in that case, what an advocate or a practitioner could tell you in that case is, well, of course the reported violations have gone down, because no victim in their right mind is going to call the police in the middle of the night when the respondent shows up at her house, because if the law enforcement officer arrives on the scene, she's equally in violation of the order, because she is having contact with him as much as he is having contact with her. So of course the victim is not going to call and report a violation, she'll get herself arrested as well. So you would anticipate that. He was a good researcher in the sense of sort of the tactical side of research, but he didn't understand research in context. He didn't understand the reality of it. I think his study would have been a whole lot better if he'd involved advocates in that study, and they would have been able to share with him, well, now wait a minute, let's talk about how in practice that might have played out. I think mistakes are made in research if we don't have collaborations. I was at another large research conference, a criminal justice research related conference, and heard a presentation by a team of researchers. They were looking at the effectiveness of domestic violence programs, specifically shelters. And so they were comparing the number of shelter beds to homicide rates. And lo and behold, what they were finding is that while the number of shelter beds available was increasing, homicide rates were not decreasing. And so to their way of thinking, and what they were sharing with this workshop audience, was that shelters were not effective in that way. And again, my reaction to that was, I think you don't understand the context of shelters, how they operate, how they affect homicide rates at all. I think it was an incorrect report of data. The implications of what they were, or the interpretation, I should say, of their findings were incorrect. Again, the statistical package may have been correct. The way they analyzed the data, that's fine. But when you get to the point of then trying to interpret that, I think you need the practitioner point of view in order to really be able to make effective research happen. So I think it's extremely important for these collaborations to happen, because research can be wrong if the collaborations don't happen. I also think those collaborations are important because who holds the best research questions? I don't think it's those of us in academia. I think the people who hold the best research questions are practitioners and advocates who work with women and kids and offenders all day long, and they know what we don't yet know. Early on, as this center got started, I called a colleague of mine who at that time was an advocate in a domestic violence program in Louisville, Kentucky. And I was trying to convince her that she should be part of a research project with us. Now, I think this is part of the evolution. The early requests that we made in the early 2000s, late 1990s and the early 2000s, to get advocates involved, they looked at that as, why would I? That's not of interest to me. That's not relevant to what I do. And that was her reaction. She said, I'm not a researcher, I'm an advocate. And I told her I didn't need another researcher. That's what we brought to it. I needed advocates. No, she didn't want to do it. Finally she said, research sounds boring. I have to be honest about that, but it's more than that. I'm just having a bad day. We had a woman come into shelter this morning who was here as a child with her mother. And that has just really destroyed all of us working here today. We started asking questions about just how effective our work is. She said, why is it that that woman would experience violence in her childhood by watching it, and then she ends up succeeding as an adult as well, and yet there are other women who see it in their childhoods and never go on to experience violence in their adulthood. What are the experiences that make these women different? And I said, my goodness, you know what you just asked me? That's a research question. Because that's all research is. It's what you need to know. And advocates and practitioners are in the best position to tell us what it is we need to know. So that too is why we need to have collaborations happen.
How do you go about making a collaboration happen? What do you do to facilitate that collaboration, to make sure that partnership happens?
I think that's an exceptionally important question. The road to effective collaborations is not an easy one. It's not an obvious one. Researchers and practitioners don't necessarily even talk the same language. You can't put a package of collaboration together without putting a lot of time, investing a lot of time in making sure that the two parties, in other words, the advocates and practitioners and the researchers, can even talk the same language. If you talk to an advocate or a practitioner about a surveillance study, well, surveillance means one thing to a researcher. An advocate probably thinks that's a study about stalking. The language is not even the same thing. What's SPSS? What's an IRB? Who talks that way? The language isn't the same. The perspectives going into a study aren't the same. So I think the first thing that has to happen is that you have to attend to the fact that practitioners bring different experiences and perspectives, researchers bring different experiences and perspectives, and you have to invest some time in making sure that they're going to be able to communicate with one another, and that they will have mutual respect for one another as well. I think historically, unfortunately, there's been a tendency on the part of those of us in academia to look down upon those in the practice field as not having the right kind of degree, not having a doctor in front of their name, and so obviously they can't contribute as much as I can contribute to a research project because I've got a Ph.D. after my name. In academia, a terminal degree is so important. An advocate or practitioner would probably look at terminal degree and think you have to die to get it. The language isn't the same, and I'm afraid sometimes the respect isn't built in. Academics may look at advocates and say, you all don't have the right degrees. Advocates may look at academics and say, you can't possibly understand the real world. Now, neither one of those things is true, but I'm afraid, unfortunately, that sometimes that's what people come into. I think we also have to understand on the research side that advocates haven't always had great experiences with researchers. The advocates we began to talk to as we started getting the center going talked about hit and run research. This notion that you come in and say, I'd love to have all your data, and you either interview people or you look through records with permission, and then you walk away with all your raw data, never to be heard from again. I heard one advocate tell me it was like a bad date. It's really nice as a way to get you to go out on the date, but you never hear from the person afterwards. I think that kind of mistake has been made. I heard an advocate talk about drowning or swimming in the wake of the researcher, which was a way to say, my gosh, I don't even know what the findings are. The findings are now being made public. I'm trying to go and get money from my legislature, and yet I've got a local researcher from the university in the same town where I live, making some statement about research done at my shelter, my Great Crisis Program. So that there are some negative experiences that advocates and practitioners have had that make them less likely to want to be involved in research studies. And I think they have also understood researchers as limited in their use, because really the only thing you want a researcher for is to evaluate the findings of your particular grant that you got, or to write up a little evaluation, or just some of the statistics from services you provided in a particular year. I think we haven't had enough experience to understand when the academics don't yet understand what an advocate can lend or a practitioner can lend to the development of research questions, And in the same way, I don't think advocates and practitioners yet understand the kind of input that a researcher can provide to developing a program, to writing a grant, not just evaluating it in the end, but integrate. If you are an advocate or a policymaker and you're writing a grant to fund a program, don't just bifurcate the grant so that you have the whole grant over here and the evaluation part over here, and that's where the researchers are, just in this evaluation part. Integrate that so that it's a full partnership, and you're going to find that it's going to be much more effective in that way.
What kind of characteristics or qualifications do you look for in a partner?
I think there has to be trust for some of the reasons that I shared a moment ago, where there have been prior bad experiences, where there has not been a lack of trust. How many researchers would be able to go into a research study without getting paid? I mean, how many vice presidents for research or deans at a university would be delighted if their researchers were going out doing research with no federal or state money or foundation funding of any kind? And yet we have an expectation that advocates are going to give researchers access to their files and time for interviews and all kinds of things. And of course, we're not going to make sure that advocates or practitioners get paid as part of that. We have to start developing bonds and I think sharing a lot more trust between the two. So I think one kind of characteristic is that we need to go in as trusting partners and understand that different people are going to have different perspectives, but that also means that they have different kinds of strengths to provide to a project as well.
What's been most helpful in terms of developing a successful partnership? What types of maybe professional factors, could be organizational, could be personality factors? You know, what do you think goes into defining what a successful researcher-practitioner collaboration is?
I think when there are benefits to both parties, meaning the researchers as well as the advocates and practitioners, you're going to have the best kinds of collaboration. So for example, if you have a group of advocates and practitioners, and let's say they're going to their legislature, and they need some help in putting together the argument for why a piece of legislation is needed. Having a researcher involved who can pull together data, either within that state or do a state-by-state comparison of what other states have done legislatively, that's going to give a tangible benefit to that group of practitioners and advocates so that they in turn can go to their legislature and get something meaningful out of that. When you have a researcher who is able to write a research paper from a study, to either get a study in the first place or write a research paper, those kinds of things begin to help on the researcher side. What both of those things are starting to suggest, I think, is that you really need to understand what is going to be of benefit to the other party. You've got to understand, if you're a practitioner or an advocate, what tenure is. What is that thing, and why are they so worried about it? Well, they're worried about it because it has everything in the world to do with their careers. Why are they so worried about getting a federal grant? What's indirect costs? And why in the world is it 40-some%? Our administrative costs for our agency are not at all close to that kind of, what is it, 46% or 32%, whatever it is for that university. So I think it means you've got to understand the perspectives of both sides, and you've got to understand the degree to which or how being involved in a research study can be of benefit to both parties as well.
Now, on the flip side, what are some of the challenges or barriers to developing a successful partnership?
I think if you go in as a researcher, for example, if you go in focused only on what I need access to your shelter, I need access to your rape crisis center, I need you to use your trusting relationship with survivors who've gone through your program, and then they can sit down with me. I can then extract all of these findings from them and go off and write a study and write a paper off of this study, and it'll all be great, and I'll get tenure and all of that. If you go in focused only on your own needs, focused only on the science that's behind you, not on what your findings are going to provide in the way of help for the practitioner audience, then that is going to be a mistake. If you go in acting as though you are smarter simply because you have an alphabet before or after your name, then you're not going to find advocates who are interested in collaborating with you at all.
Anything else from an organizational perspective that might be a barrier?
I think spending some time trying to understand the perspective of the other is invaluable. In Kentucky these days, I don't think either side, and by that I would mean the research side or the advocate practitioner side, that we ever now approach a research project without thinking about how to involve the other side. The value of that is that if you're running a domestic violence program and you're wanting to look at a research study that would, you want to evaluate your child witness program. You have a program within your shelter, for example, that provides services to kids who have witnessed domestic violence or intimate partner violence in their home. And so you go ahead and write up your program, and you call up at the last minute. You call the researcher and you ask them if they would kind of send you a CV and they'd like to stick you on the grant to be the evaluator. If you approach it that way, don't start doing your collaboration right up front at the idea stage, then the likelihood of success is going to be extremely limited. I think these days we've evolved so far now in these collaborations that grant, those who are funders now, people who are going to provide the grants, have an expectation that advocates have been brought in early on in the development of the research question, that researchers have been brought in on the design of the program, not just in the design of the evaluation of that program, that there is that expectation now.
You touched upon this in terms of the needs of the researcher and the needs of the practitioner. In your experiences, how have you gone about balancing those? Because sometimes those needs are the same, sometimes they're different, sometimes they're in conflict with each other. But in terms of, I want to say, helping the collaboration to be successful, how do you go about balancing those?
I think there will not be an exact balance in every single collaboration. And that will be bad if it's always imbalanced in the same direction, or if you don't have an existing relationship. If you have an existing relationship, if you're a researcher and you have an existing relationship with the advocacy group or the policy group, the practitioner group, the fact that in one case they're simply kind of pitching in to help and they don't have a direct benefit, that's not a problem, because next time the balance will go the other way. That just all harkens back to the development of a relationship. An ongoing relationship rather than simply connecting on a particular project and then going away and you don't see them again until the next grant is out there and you're wanting to write that grant, so you have a meeting at that point, you never see each other in between. So I think that speaks to the fact that you have to have an ongoing collaboration, ongoing relationship that exists between the calls for proposals. That doesn't wait until that grant is half written and then you're trying to call somebody at that point. I think it's also very important to make sure that when you're generating a grant that you do keep in mind what is going to be helpful to practitioners. At the center, one of the things that we did, for example, was send a survey to advocates in rape crisis programs and domestic violence programs. And we asked them in this survey, what is it that you need to know in order to do your work better? What kinds of questions do you have? And we gave them an exhaustive list of the kinds of questions that might come up, and then they ranked what was important to them in the way of doing their work. What is it that they didn't know that they felt that they needed to know? Now the findings from those surveys are extremely interesting. And we can write that up. On the research side, we can write that up. And we can tell you that in some cases on questions, rape crisis staff are different than domestic violence staff. And we can also tell you that staff who have been in programs for more than 10 years are going to have different needs than staff who are very, very new. We're going to be able to tell you that staff who provide crisis services are going to look fairly different than those who provide long-term services from the more clinical perspective. Isn't that very interesting? I can write up a paper and I can get that published, and it means nothing to all of the people who participated in actually providing that input. What we did here in the center was, rather than write up that paper, we never did that actually. What we did instead was take the top 10 items that were ranked as important by the advocates in our own state. And then we did sort of lay versions of literature reviews. and posted those on our websites. So all those questions about the effectiveness of legal interventions, about how survivors ranked the effectiveness of the services they received from shelters and rape crisis programs, questions they had about do women really lose custody of their children if they seek services, seek help from law enforcement or from a protective services agency, all of those kinds of questions. Rather than ending up in writing a scientific article, we provided that back to all of the advocates so that they can now look at the answers to all. It's not one simple answer, it's a literature review. So they now become more adept, I think, in understanding what the literature is, what it can provide, and that, even though it took a lot of our time to do, it was a great investment. Hopefully they can perhaps use those data, use that literature to provide better services, but I think they can also see from that experience that researchers can provide something that's useful to me in the work I do every day with women.
Are there any other products, if you will, that have been produced? You just mentioned this layperson literature review. Are there any other products that have been produced as a result of the collaborations you've been involved in?
One of the first things that we did when we began this center and we knew going in that we wanted the model of this center to be one where there were collaborations, where that was just the norm. Perhaps again because I'm hybrid, which is to say I came from the practice and policy side and now I'm in academia. I understood that we weren't going to be any good as a center unless those kinds of collaborations existed. I felt like for a lot of the reasons we've talked about today, that those kinds of relationships weren't automatic. They weren't natural relationships between policymakers and researchers, between advocates and researchers. They weren't going to naturally happen. That we needed to invest some time in making sure that both sides were ready for that. One of the things that we did was to write a grant to the U.S. Department of Justice, and we asked for funding to help us provide training to advocates on what research is. So we pulled together some of the top researchers in the country, and we invited advocates from all over the U.S. We hosted it 3 times, and we provided a 2-day training, and in some cases a 3-day training, on what the heck research is. We paid every expense for advocates to come, whether it was from Houston or Cincinnati or anywhere in the U.S., for them to come to Kentucky and stay this entire time and receive this training. They understood what a research hypothesis was. We spent actually some time talking about why research didn't work for them. I began to learn things like drive-by research and the difference in language and all the things that kept coming up for advocates. We began to talk about those, and then we just spent some time telling them about what the research process was so that they could begin to understand it a little bit better. They shared a lot of the intimidation they had being in the same room or on the same project with a researcher who talked about research design and things they didn't know about. Doesn't mean they're not intelligent, it's just not material they knew about, but they felt intimidated by being part of that process. So we began to tell them what a hypothesis was and what a research design was and what are the advantages of one versus another, what's the difference between quantitative and qualitative. We then took them all the way through the design of a research project. And at the very end, the last thing we did on that final day was we brought in folks from the Institutional Review Board, the IRB, from our own university, and we had the advocates pitch their research design, their proposal to that mock IRB. So they would then also understand what researchers have to go through, why they design studies in a certain way. And I hope that we also helped advocates understand that one of the important things they can bring to a research collaboration is a unique understanding of human subjects' concerns and how to approach survivors and how to ensure that there are not additional risks that survivors are going to experience by virtue of being a part of a research study. So we put that whole product together, if you will, that agenda we put together, and to go along with that, we added a couple of products. One that is how do I read a research article again? Showing them that you can, for example, skip the part about methods. You don't really have to read that. It's somewhat boring and it means nothing to the outcome. You just need to read, here's what an abstract will do, here's what a literature review will do, here's what a discussion section means, here's what conclusions means, here's why you need to have something in there about the limitations of this study. Teaching them how to read a research article so they can begin to read a research article. For that year, the people who attended our particular study, our training, got a subscription to a top journal in our field for a year because I wanted them to start having exposure to literature. And a lot of the advocates in our state, I'm proud to tell you, still have those subscriptions to journals because they can, and that they now know what a review journal is. And that maybe for some of them who aren't going to be able to read lots and lots of individual studies, the idea of reading a literature review is helpful because that describes a lot of different studies. That's the kind of very tangible, concrete thing that they found very, very helpful. We also designed for them a proposal document because particularly advocates from all over the country when they were here talked about, my local researcher from my local university will come and say, gosh, I need you to participate in this study. It'll be the greatest thing in the world. Just let me come in and interview women in shelter. Or let me talk to the women who've at some point in the past received services through the Rape Crisis Center. Or let me talk to the women who've gone through court. Something like that. The second thing we provided them was a document that was a research proposal. Because so many of the advocates talked about experiences where in their hometowns, a researcher would come, phone them up, or send them an email from the local university saying, I've got this great idea for the study. We need access to the survivors who've come through shelter or who've been served at the Rape Crisis Center or who've gone to court with you. We want to interview those women. It will be just great. Sign on, won't you? And how are advocates going to know whether that's a good research design? How are they even going to know that? So we produced an example of a proposal, the kinds of questions that you ought to ask researchers before you let them anywhere near survivors who've been through your program. And then we encourage them to find partners within their local universities, researchers they could trust, and have those researchers without identifiers on the proposal review those. Or maybe there would be researchers who would contribute a little bit of time to the State Domestic Violence Coalition or the State Rape Crisis Coalition to do a blind review of proposals that have come into a local shelter or a local rape crisis center. So the advocates themselves don't have to figure out if that's a good proposal, but they have input on whether or not that's a good proposal and whether or not that would be a good idea to let that study go on or let yourself become a partner within that particular research study.
I remember being part of that, so I'm
yes, you
having flashbacks going, what a wonderful experience I had.
Yes.
I know you've been involved in a lot of collaborations. Could you describe how you go about sustaining a partnership rather than have it be, just sort of project specific? What types of things are involved in terms of sustaining a more long-term partnership?
I think the most effective collaborations are those that are long-term, not just designed around a particular research study. We're going to meet once before the grant gets submitted and then once after the grant gets submitted. Those are not going to be the most effective. Instead, I think you've got to start involving each other in what you do. So advocates are involved in here at the center, for example, advocates are involved in every scientific meeting or conference or training that we do here. We do so-called scholarships where we pay for their travel and get them here so they can sit in. And it may, early on it didn't seem that interesting to advocates, but increasingly they now know in our state now. I would venture to say, if you mention the names of some of the top researchers in the country, advocates here in Kentucky would know who that is. Or they would know that area, that person does research in rape and sexual assault. That researcher does studies in partner violence area. They're really becoming accustomed to being on our campus, and it's not a foreign place for them anymore. And when advocates hold trainings in our own state, there is a large conference that's held every December that the advocates, the Domestic Violence Coalition and the State Association of Sexual Assault Programs, they jointly host. you'll find researchers on those doing workshops at that conference every single year. It is the norm. So we know each other, we're on each other's projects all the time, so that the relationship is not just project specific. We're involved in each other's activities in lots of different ways. I know that there are going to be some researchers who say, I don't have time to put together a workshop for a practitioner audience, or I don't have time to go to a particular meeting or whatever. It's not around a grant. I got to be, funding focused. But my contention is that if you make those kinds of investments, they will pay off in the long run in terms of grants, because you will have much more effective and well-written grants because you'll have the active participation of advocates.
So in closing, what advice would you give to a researcher who might be interested in developing their first partnership? And I'm going to ask you the same question about a practitioner as well.
I think the best way for a researcher to start building a collaboration is not to wait for the grant. In fact, I think the first approach to a policy advocacy organization, or to a local domestic violence program, or a local rape crisis center, or to your local court system, wherever you want to go do your research, do not make that overture just when the RFP is out there and you've got a deadline on this grant. Go see them for no reason, or go see them just to introduce yourself, or go sit in court and watch it happen. Again, I know these are time investments, but they're going to give you credibility, and I think you're going to learn. You're going to start seeing some of that context that advocates and practitioners have very naturally because they're in the system and they see it happen. That is an investment of time that will absolutely pay off. So I think begin to build your relationship long before you start working on a specific grant project.
And then what advice would you give a practitioner who might want to collaborate with a researcher?
I think it would probably make sense to find a researcher you know and say, help me navigate your university. Because it is very difficult to look on a website and know who might be a good collaborator. So I think find a researcher. If you don't know of a particular researcher in your local area, contact some of the folks who are at a Center for Research on Violence Against Women, or who are extremely well known in the field, and say, you know what, I live in Milwaukee, or I live in somewhere in Florida, or wherever you are, and say, who at my local university is somebody I can approach? Who can I do research with? If I'm in Austin, Texas, who do I approach at the University of Texas? Or if I'm in College Station, who do I approach at Texas A&M? Where do I go? And get some advice about who to go and make that approach with. It is certainly very hard. Universities are huge, and departments are extremely hard to navigate sometimes. It's hard when you're inside academia to know who to collaborate with. Universities are extremely difficult, even for researchers who are within it, to know how to do interdisciplinary type research and how to step outside your own department. We also, as a center, spend a lot of time working on how to help, even within our own institution, make sure that psychologists are talking to epidemiologists, who are talking to social work researchers, who are talking to professors over in the law school, etc. So I think getting some help is a good idea. Out of the training that I mentioned a little while ago that we did for advocates about what research is, one of the first things that happened within days of that training being over is one of the advocates contacted me and said, I'm in Florida, I want to start having a partnership, who do I call at my local university? And I worked on that, and I came up with a suggestion for them, and I made an initial overture to that researcher and explained who I was and what we had done and what the needs of their local advocate was, and put that partnership for them together. So I think get some help would probably be the best way to approach the university, rather than just showing up on campus and trying to figure that out on your own.
What about sustaining a researcher-practitioner collaboration? What advice would you give there, either to the researcher or the practitioner, or maybe both?
Again, I think do your best to make sure that there are benefits on both sides. On the research side, don't assume that you're going to have a great collaboration if constantly advocates and practitioners are just asked to give you data, or asked to let you sit in, or ask whatever. That's not going to be a collaboration. You've got to go into it thinking, how can they also benefit from involvement with me? Make sure on both sides that it's going to be of benefit both ways. And I think that's when people get very motivated to have a sustained relationship with you. I think once you start building colleagueships, personal colleagueships, then you're also going to be able to sustain something longer. Again, that's the advantage of having contacts with advocates or with practitioners, with researchers, whatever your perspective, outside of any grant project. Because you do develop colleagueships then that are not project specific. They're outside of that, and I think that is going to help you then sustain the relationship over time.
So in closing, do you have any comments that you'd like to offer, or something maybe we didn't talk about that you'd like to put on the table? Something I forgot to ask about?
I think what we need to remember is that this idea of translational research, this idea of collaborations between people in practice and people in research is not just catchy. It's not just kind of the next trend that will be gone eventually. I think it is ultimately the way to do research in the violence against women area. It is absolutely the way to do research. And it's absolutely the way to ensure that the services that you provide are effective. If you can do evaluations, if you can have these kinds of partnerships. So ultimately, if we go back to the metaphor about the riverbank, if there are a lot of footprints along that riverbank between those people who are providing direct services and pulling drowning people out of the river, and those people who are upriver able to start putting the processes in place to answer questions, if there are a lot of footprints between them, I think we have the best shot at ending violence against women around the world.